Okay.
Okay, so I guess we're going to go ahead and get started now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our presentation on offshore wind in North Carolina. I think I see a few names I recognize, which is great, and also some I don't, which is also great. So welcome, everybody. I'm Deborah Hooker. I'm one of the co-leaders of the North Carolina Central and Cape Fear Region chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. And we're really happy tonight to be partnering with the good people in the Raleigh Citizens Climate Lobby chapter. They're helping us bring you this update on the status of offshore wind in our state. I'm guessing that some of you might not be familiar with Citizens Climate Lobby, so let me just take a minute to tell you a little bit about us. CCL is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that was formed in 2007 with just 2 members. It now has 530 active chapters in the United States and abroad, and 14 of those chapters happen to be right here in North Carolina. And I think one thing that really distinguishes CCL from a lot of other climate organizations is that we welcome all political perspectives. And that's because we understand that lasting change can only come about through collaborating with a diverse group of stakeholders. So in other words, we focus on shared values rather than on any partisan divide. And as our title suggests, one of our prime activities is lobbying. That is, we talk, and we talk a lot. We talk to our state and local and national representatives. We talk to civic groups. We talk to folks in our community. And if you'll go to the next slide, Karly. And in our lobbying, we're always advocating for climate legislation that is both effective and efficient in reducing emissions, but also policies that are economically beneficial and socially just. Next slide, please. So currently, our advocacy is focused on 4 policy agendas: carbon pricing, healthy forests, building electrification and efficiency, and clean energy permitting reform. If you'd like more information about Citizens Climate Lobby, there'll be a slide at the end with the URL, but you could also put your information in the chat and one of us will get back to you. And so finally, before I turn the program over to Phyllis to introduce our speaker, and perhaps because some of you are watching the clock, this presentation will run about 30 minutes and then we will have another 10 or 15 minutes for a Q&A. So Beth, you've started the recording, so Phyllis, over to you.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you for sharing about our organization. I'm Phyllis Lefebvre, and as Deborah said, I co-lead the chapter for Central and Cape Fear region, and we are very happy and grateful to have Karly present to us tonight on this very important topic. I'd like to read a little bit about Karly, her bio. She joined the Southeastern Wind Coalition in January 2022. She graduated from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington in 2021 with a MS in Coastal and Ocean Policy, completing a capstone on the economic and environmental impacts of hazardous waste trade on developing nations. Karly is also a graduate of Salisbury University in Salisbury, Maryland, and holds a BS in biology. In her role, Karly leads Southeastern Wind Coalition's work to reduce barriers for offshore and land-based wind development in North Carolina through grassroots and grasstops outreach. Through this work, Karly coordinates coalition building efforts for offshore wind for North Carolina, which provides a platform for stakeholder groups to get involved in offshore wind policy and regulatory issues. And I do want to mention a couple more housekeeping things. As was mentioned, this is going to be recorded. We do intend to share the recording with you. as well as the slide deck that Karly has put together. And we will have Q&A. If you could please put your questions in the Q&A portion at the bottom of the Zoom there. And so I'd like to go ahead and turn this program over to Karly, and thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Phyllis, and hello, everybody. And thank you to the CCL chapter for having me. I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk to you a little bit about offshore wind at a high level, at a national level, and give you a little bit of a snapshot of what's going on in the industry and what I do here at Southeastern Wind Coalition, and then transition a little bit more into the North Carolina specific opportunities and barriers related to the offshore wind industry. So I think that Phyllis covered my background really well, so I'm just going to go ahead and hop into it. And just a little bit more background about the Southeastern Wind Coalition. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we are North Carolina based in the sense that we were founded in North Carolina, and that's where most of our work is centered. But we do actually have a regional footprint, and that extends from Virginia down to Florida and over to Louisiana. So we also handle some of what we were defined as central states, which are landlocked or coastline limited states that are a little bit more focused on the land-based wind side of things. So sorry, my puppy decided it's time to play with his squeaky toy. So again, when you look at our membership, sorry, bear with me one second. Okay, when you look at our membership, a lot of folks get the impression that we are actually a trade organization, but we are a C3 and we're education based. And that's really important for a lot of reasons, because I think it puts us in kind of a unique place to be able to talk to developers of offshore and land-based wind projects, the utilities that are potentially purchasing power from those projects or stakeholders in those projects. We're also able to work really closely with original equipment manufacturers and supply chain economic developers, local communities. And because of that network that we have, we're really able to advance wind generation or wind development in a holistic sense. Okay, and just to give you a little bit of a history of offshore wind, I really just show this slide to remind folks that offshore wind might be a nascent industry in the United States, but it's been around for quite a while, and it got its footing specifically in Denmark, where the first pilot project started, and over the course of the late 90s, those pilot projects developed into commercial or utility scale projects, and economies of scale were developed, and the supply chain was built out. And now that number is probably out of just in the past few months, but more than 64 gigawatts of offshore wind that's deployed worldwide. And it is very much a commercially available and proven technology that's been successful in a lot of places. The other really interesting part about that evolution from the first pilot projects to the generation of wind turbines that we're seeing today is that they're much larger. And the early offshore wind turbines were in the 5 or 6 or 7 megawatt range, and now we're looking at turbines for the next generation of projects that are 14 or 15 or even up to 20 megawatts. And that means that, yes, the turbines are larger, but that helps bring down project cost, and it also helps produce more energy in the same project footprint. So this map, I know there's a lot going on in this map, but this is from the Department of Energy's 2023 Offshore Wind Market Report. And this really just shows the location of I think this probably captures all the projects that are currently in the pipeline for offshore wind just on the East Coast, the Central Atlantic, doesn't include the Northeast. But just to give you a sense that there's a lot going on in the Central Atlantic. And as of the end of 2023, the offshore wind project pipeline actually reached a generation capacity of 52 gigawatts. And just to break that down a little bit further and give a little bit of context, out of those 52 gigawatts, there are only 3 projects that are currently in operation. Block Island is a small project off the coast of Block Island, Rhode Island, that's been in operation for, I think, 7 years now. That's just a small 30 megawatt project. Dominion Energy has 2 individual pilot turbines off the coast of Virginia Beach, and the South Fork Wind Farm actually just came online about 2 weeks ago. And so that's the first truly commercial scale project. There's one project that's also under construction actively right now, which is Vineyard Wind, and that should be wrapping up construction within, hopefully by Q2 or Q3 of 2024. And then the larger commercial project that Dominion Energy is building adjacent to their original pilot project is working on their onshore construction now, and they'll start that offshore construction in just a few months. And then there's an additional 37 projects in the development pipeline, and a few more about to come online after an upcoming auction in the Gulf of Mexico in the next couple months. So, and this map just really, or I'm sorry, this graph really just gives you another way of looking at that project pipeline. And again, what I'm trying to establish here is that this total pipeline of 52 gigawatts or 52,000 megawatts is quite large, and it's a milestone, and we only have a very small portion of that in operation. And there's a very, very large portion of that pipeline that is in the permitting or site control phase. And the reason I'm taking the time to point that out is because permitting is not usually a quick process. With the CCL's policy agenda, I know that clean energy permitting reform is something that you all focus on, and it's not at all my area of expertise, but I do know that the American Clean Power Association does have some good resources if you want to learn a little bit more about it, and kind of what the industry is advocating for. But the reason that is important to us at the Southeastern Wind Coalition or on a North Carolina scale is because the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 helped renew the investment tax credit, or the ITC tax credit. And that tax credit provides a 30% subsidy for offshore wind projects through the year of 2032. And after 2032, there's uncertainty that it could be extended, but there's a lot of factors that kind of play into how that works, and federal elections are one of them. But it's also noteworthy that 30% tax credit could be increased to 50% if there's a certain level of domestic content or onshoring or project activity in what is designated as an energy community. And a 50% tax credit is very significant for any large scale project. But when you're talking about a project that's in the 6 or 7 or 8 or $9 billion range, a 50% tax credit is really, really significant. So what we are trying to communicate on everything from the federal to the state level is that this near-term development and streamlining the process and building support for offshore wind all the way up from the local level to the federal level is really important to help make sure that we can get these projects through the permitting pipeline and they can take advantage of that ITC tax credit. And I'm not going to go into detail about the federal leasing and regulatory process, but the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is housed within the Department of the Interior, and they are the ones that manage pretty much all energy-related leasing on the Outer Continental Shelf. And this is all available on their website, but there's a lot of steps is what I'm trying to show here. The permitting process is very complex, especially when it comes to the environmental review process, stakeholder engagement, the review of site assessment plans and construction and operation plans, and all the surveying and data collection that goes into that. Offshore wind is a very long lead time resource. There's a lot of steps and science and data collection that goes into it. So again, all the more reason why the timeline and planning ahead is very important to make sure that offshore wind is possible. And just to highlight a few projects that have had some recent milestones, I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, but South Fork Wind just started commercial operation in, I believe it was March 14th. And it's a relatively small project compared to some of the projects that are going to come online within the next few years, but there were a lot of economic development and domestic investment related milestones with this project, and I very much encourage you to read more about it. But all of the 36 turbine blades for this project were actually marshaled at the New London State Pier in Connecticut, and this is a really great example of an underutilized port facility that was invested in by offshore wind developers and partners, and it brought life and economic development back to this port. And this project also included the first offshore wind substation, and that was a huge domestic investment that we have not seen before. And it's a great sign that this is possible. And despite what we've seen in the news over the past year about economic headwinds and supply chain constraints and inflation and all that good stuff, you know, those milestones are being met, and the early ones are the hardest, but it's paving the way for more future domestic investment. Another one that I wanted to flag, so Dominion Energy's Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind, as I mentioned before, they've got 2 pilot turbines off the coast of Virginia Beach, and they've been in the water for a couple of years. And then they're building a larger commercial project adjacent to that pilot project. But so this picture on the top actually shows the first 4 monopiles for this project arriving on a barge from Germany, and they're going to be they got delivered to the port in Virginia, and then they're going to be staged and then brought out and installed for that project in the coming months. But this project, again, is significant because it is the largest commercial scale project. It will be one of the first large scale commercial scale projects in the United States. But what's really important about it is that it is on time and on budget. Dominion Energy has really done a lot of things right in terms of cost and ratepayer protections. And because Dominion Energy has been able to take advantage of the PTC tax credit through the Inflation Reduction Act, they have been able to guarantee 92% fixed costs for their project. And the LCOE, or the levelized cost of energy for that project, is $77 a megawatt hour, which is about $20 to $30 a megawatt hour lower than some of the projects we're seeing in the Northeast. And the Virginia Public Service Commission has also worked with Dominion and with stakeholders to work out some significant consumer protections for this project. So it is a $9.8 billion project. I think it started out in the $7 billion range, but if Dominion if costs overrun to a certain amount, I believe it's $10 or $11 billion, that cost will impact ratepayers. But after that point, there is statute in place that will make sure that ratepayers are not impacted directly, and that the shareholders of Dominion Energy are the ones that make up for that increased cost. So again, these early scale gigawatts and early scale milestones are the hardest and the most expensive and the ones that are facing the most challenges. But the CVAL project is a great example of some of the ways that state government and developers are working together to get creative and make sure they can make these projects happen, bring economic benefit, but protect ratepayers at the same time. And I am going to touch on two North Carolina projects before I kind of zoom into what's going on in North Carolina. But Kitty Hawk Wind, it's off the coast of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And this project is one lease area. It's all being developed by one developer, and it was leased to this developer in 2017, but it's actually being developed in 2 tranches. And those 2 tranches are kind of in different stages of development, which is a little bit confusing. But that first part of the project, the northern part of the project, is proposed to onshore in Virginia Beach. And then the second part, or the southern part of the project, is still early on, where they're not really sure where they would onshore or what that all would look like. But we're hoping to see some progress with that project throughout the year for the northern part of the project. So right now, the northern part of the project has done a lot of the more in-depth environmental surveys and submitted more of their consistency documents with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And so we know a little bit more about some of the stakeholder engagement and some of the research they've done, and where their cables are going to go, and there's more information about the project specs available. The southern part of that project we don't have quite that information yet, but there is a lot of opposition coming out of Virginia Beach, and a lot of folks concerned about the potential impacts of the construction of that cable landing in Virginia. And if you do go on the Kitty Hawk Wind website, they actually just recently published an economic impact assessment that outlines the direct revenue that Virginia Beach itself would receive from this project, but the larger tax revenue and jobs that would be brought to the Hampton Roads area and the entire Commonwealth of Virginia. So that's a really interesting study if economic benefit is your thing. Carolina Long Bay is just off the coast of Bald Head Island, so south of Wilmington. And this project was just leased in 2022, and it's actually split into 2 different lease areas, and there's 2 different leaseholders. So Duke Energy, the utility, has an unregulated subsidy that holds one of those leases, and then Total Energies, which is an oil and gas major based, they're a French company, owns the other half of it. And again, very early in the site assessment phases of this project, and we don't know a lot other than kind of how big it is and how many turbines there would be and how much energy it could generate. But something interesting to highlight about this project is that the Duke Energy and Total Energies actually hired a Morehead City-based company called Geodynamics to do their early survey activities. And these weren't even survey activities to figure out where the turbines would go or any of those things. They were purely just figuring out where they could moor their meteorological buoys to help them collect wind and wave data over the next couple of years. So again, very, very early stage development. It's probably important to mention that both the Kitty Hawk, I think the Kitty Hawk North project is looking around a 2030 operation date. The Kitty Hawk South project's around 2032 estimated operation date. And Carolina Long Bay is also estimating a 2032 operation date. Okay, I'm going to get a little bit more into North Carolina specific things here on out, and hopefully use the background that I just provided to give you a little bit more information about why we care about this in North Carolina. And I wanted to start out by communicating some of the opportunities and barriers that SCWC uses to kind of communicate what's going on in North Carolina. And there are many more than this, but I think these are the top three that I generally end up spending time working on or talking about. And the first piece of that is just the utility market structure of Duke Energy, and really just the fact that we have a monopoly in a utility monopoly in North Carolina, and that's very different from the RTO structures that we see in many of the northeastern states that are a little bit further along with projects. So it's interesting because, again, we don't have many projects that are far along in the Southeast other than this CVOW project. And it's hard to make a comparison directly to projects in the Northeast, not only, you know, how they're built and how large they are and how much energy they generate, and how that power is procured, but just the way that the utilities interact with that project is also very different in the Southeast. So that's kind of uncharted territory for the industry, if you will. Political dynamics are also interesting in North Carolina. We do see a lot of support for solar energy in North Carolina, and we have seen an increased support for renewable energy in North Carolina. But offshore wind is, I think it's safe to say, that is a very partisan issue at the General Assembly. And it's something that is just new to a lot of people, and there's kind of an information vacuum that exists, and that definitely plays into the level of uncertainty that decision makers have around offshore wind. And that has translated into some anti-wind policies that have popped up over the years. But in 2021, North Carolina passed House Bill 951, which essentially codified our state's carbon reduction goals, and it directed essentially Duke Energy to propose a plan to the Utilities Commission or our state regulators every 2 years to say how they're going to reduce their carbon emission levels to meet that 70% reduction goal set forth in this bill. But there is kind of a caveat of making sure that it's a least cost pathway. And it's not always really clear how policymakers or regulators are interpreting least cost. And while this bill introduces a great opportunity for offshore wind to become part of our future generation mix in North Carolina, there's also kind of that tight timeline that we're working with because of the uncertainty that exists with those Inflation Reduction Act tax credits after 2032. So those are kind of the sticking points with offshore wind. North Carolina does have a lot of great advantages for not only offshore wind development, but for the economic opportunities related to the larger industry. And one of the things that Southeastern Wind Coalition does is we host a supply chain database and registry, and we actually keep track of all of the, or as many companies that we can get a hold of that already support the land-based wind supply chain industry and, you know, could kind of pivot to support offshore wind, or companies that, you know, already do something that could transition to support the offshore wind industry. So as of the beginning of this year, we have about 55 companies already in the land-based wind supply chain. And I think there's 70-ish additional companies just in North Carolina alone that are interested in supporting the offshore wind industry. And there's some really great examples from South Carolina. Prysmian Cable Manufacturing Company, Nexans, and a few other large companies that are using their South Carolina specific plants to support offshore wind projects in the Northeast. And again, it's important to kind of remember that whether or not steel is in the water off of our coast, there's still this large project pipeline, and that does really present a regional opportunity for supply chain. Something else I'd like to share with people is, so when you look at an offshore wind turbine, they're quite large, and what we call tier 1 components, so the blades and the towers and the nacelle that houses the rotor, those are all very, very large, and they do have to be manufactured at a port or adjacent to a port, because you can't ship an offshore wind blade, down Route 40 to the ocean. That's not going to work. So those large components do need to be manufactured port side, and that does present an economic opportunity for coastal communities. But one of my favorite fun facts about offshore wind is that there's over 8,000 components in a wind turbine, and many of those components are very, very small, and they're things that can be manufactured anywhere across the state. So we like to use our supply chain map when we go to talk to legislators, and we say, hey, you might be based in, the Triangle, or you might be based in Charlotte, or you might be based in some rural district in North Carolina, but you have X, Y, and Z manufacturers in your district that are interested in supporting the offshore wind industry and would benefit from the economic opportunity that industry would bring to North Carolina. When we communicate the benefits of offshore wind, there's a lot of benefits, but these are kind of the top 3 categories of benefits that I have been using in communication with partners, with legislators, with state regulators, specifically just with everything that's going on related to the carbon plan right now. And there was a recent filing that Duke Energy made back in January that called for an additional 4 gigawatts of load forecast that they need to plan for over the next few years. So the economic opportunity is a really big one that SWC has always talked about. But the grid benefits is a place where we're trying to make that message a little bit more widespread. And I'll go into some more slides and show some graphs on what exactly that looks like. But the other really important point is that offshore wind is commercially available and it's utility scale. It's a proven resource, and it produces clean carbon-free energy on a gigawatt scale. And when we're talking about 70% carbon reduction and 4 extra gigawatts of power that we need to plan for, and coal-fired plant retirements. We love solar. Solar is amazing, and solar is very complementary to offshore wind, but solar is built on a relatively small scale at a couple hundred megawatts at a time, where offshore wind can provide 1 or 2 or 3 gigawatts of power at a time. And that is something that we are going to need to meet the population growth that we're seeing in the Southeast, the manufacturing that we're seeing in the Southeast, especially related to EVs and batteries, and just the overall economic growth that we're seeing. So this map is from the NREL's offshore wind supply chain roadmap. And if you are interested in learning about the supply chain opportunity in the United States, I do actually really like this study. They have some good presentation slides if you don't want to read the study, front to back. There's some good summary points, but the biggest takeaway here is that a domestic offshore wind supply chain is going to require an investment of at least $22 billion in ports, installation vessels, and manufacturing facilities, approximately 34 manufacturing facilities by 2030-ish, to support about 4 to 6 gigawatts of projects coming online a year. And when you look at North Carolina and our GDP contributions to manufacturing, that is a place where we have a really big strength. And if you look at this map, this shows the total job market opportunity for major manufacturing, and North Carolina shows a significant opportunity. And this is essentially the same slide with just a different map. But one of the metrics they use to measure the opportunity for manufacturing related to the offshore wind industry is something called AIMS, the Adjacent Industry Manufacturing Scale. And basically this just shows how capable states already are at meeting what has been mapped out as the investment or supply chain needs for the industry. And again, North Carolina is one of those states that stands out very, very highly for both the larger components like the blades, but also all those small JV components that could be manufactured across the state. Okay, so moving on to the grid benefit side of it. Offshore wind, a lot of people will ask, well, offshore wind isn't, it's not producing power 100% of the time or the same way that oil or gas or nuclear is. And, while offshore wind is not by definition a dispatchable resource necessarily, and it is a variable resource, offshore wind is a very stable resource, and it's a very predictable resource. And it fluctuates much less than land-based wind, and also offshore wind turbines are much larger than land-based wind turbines, and we can use larger footprints of project area in the ocean than we can on land. And so you're getting larger scale generation from offshore wind projects and more predictable energy from offshore wind projects versus land-based wind or solar. And I do like to talk about capacity factor because I think people see a 40 to 50% capacity factor and they automatically think, oh, offshore wind turbines are only producing energy 40 to 50% of the time, that's not the case. They're producing, if you see something that says the 40 to 50% capacity factor, that means they are producing their max amount of energy 40 to 50% of the time. And the remainder of that time, they're still producing energy, maybe not at 100% capacity, but they are still producing energy. But generally that time when they are not producing as much energy is when solar is operating a little bit more efficiently. And I have a graph that I can show you momentarily. And it's also really important to remember that what we're looking for is not a grid that's made up completely of offshore wind turbines and nothing else. Grid reliability and resiliency comes from diversity of resources, and resources all have their different impacts and their different strengths and their different weaknesses. And it is, I think, very, very important to remember that offshore wind is very stable and very reliable, but it's also very complementary to solar specifically. On the commercial side of it, as I mentioned, Dominion Energy's CVOW project is quite large. And last year during Winter Storm Elliott, they, based on what they know about the project size and the type of technology they're going to use for the turbines and the wind speeds and the what the natural gas prices were during that like peak time of the storm on Christmas Eve of 2022. Dominion estimated that, and this is kind of a back of the envelope calculation, but just in that 24-hour period, if CVOW had been in full commercial scale operation, it could have saved Virginia ratepayers $115 million in fuel costs because of how much natural gas spiked during that time due to peak demand. And something else that Dominion Energy likes to share is that CVOW is expected to generate fuel savings of at least $3 billion for their customers during the project's first 10 years. But that number is honestly probably on the conservative side and is going to increase as the, as the supply chain builds out and just the whole process of developing offshore wind becomes a little bit cheaper, but also as natural gas prices increase. And so this last point here, I'll show you these graphics, but as I said before, offshore wind is very reliable, and it does not fluctuate very much from hour to hour, but it's very complementary with solar, and it's the most efficient in winter mornings before the sun rises, which is when solar is not really, giving a lot of output, but everybody's turning on their heat or turning on their lights or turning on their appliances. And it's also very efficient during storm events. And offshore wind turbines, the technology has advanced quite a bit, and turbines used to really kind of, be really efficient at low speeds or really efficient at high speeds. And the technology advancements have allowed not only turbines to do both, but to be able to capture a larger range of wind speeds. And that allows them to be efficient during storm events specifically. So this graph is winter wind and solar complementary or profile comparison in North Carolina. This one shows winter generation, and this comes from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. And this blue bar shows on peak periods in the winter time, so that 6 to 8 a.m. time period. And that dark blue line at the top is offshore wind. So you can see that it fluctuates a little bit, but it's producing at a very high capacity factor for most of the day. And it's producing almost at its highest at that time, specifically when solar is just starting to ramp up, but demand is peaking and land-based wind is ramping down. And in the Carolinas specifically, offshore wind is not as efficient in the summer, but that's when solar is a little bit more efficient. And again, you can see that when solar is really ramping down in the evening from 6 to 8 p.m., that is when offshore wind is the most steady and has the highest capacity factor. So again, this is the same slide I showed before, just kind of the categories of benefits that we like to communicate, and happy to talk at any length for any questions that you might have online or offline today. But that concludes my presentation, and hopefully we're doing good on time, but I'll pass it back to the team to advise Q&A.
Thank you, Karly. And Beth is going to be handling the Q&A. We did ask that you put your questions in the Q&A versus the chat, but I think she could probably go ahead and access both of those right now. But that was a lot of wonderful information. So thank you for that. So Beth, I'm going to turn it over to you, and as well to introduce yourself too.
Awesome. Yeah. So my name is Beth Carmichael. I am the chapter lead for the Raleigh chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. So let's get into some questions. So Bill Marshall in Asheville is wanting to know, Karly, how can we get Duke Power to latch onto wind and dramatically help deploy and use it?
Yeah. So the complicated part about the Carolina Long Bay project is, again, Duke Energy's unregulated subsidy owns the lease, but that is separate from the regulated entity of Duke Energy that reports to the Utilities Commission. So they can't just kind of, produce offshore wind power at their will. They have to make sure that it is incorporated in their generation profile in a way that's approved by the Utilities Commission. And what we are really looking for this year is for Duke to send the signals that the positive signals for offshore wind, because despite the fact that they hold this lease, it's kind of been a mixed bag, depending on who you talk to and what day you talk to them about where they stand on offshore wind and what their plans are. So we really want Duke Energy to provide that certainty to our state regulators. And what we really want to see at the end of 2024, when this current carbon plan process completes, is the state regulators to issue an order that essentially okays Duke Energy to move forward with spending the money that they need to spend to advance project development, because these projects are very capital intensive, and there's a lot of work that has to be done, even before you can think about procuring, manufacturing components, the blades and the towers and all of that. There's so much work that has to go in on the research side of it, on the permitting side of it, on the transmission side of it. And that is what makes it a long lead time resource. And if we do want to meet that 2032 deadline, not only for carbon reduction, but also to allow those projects to take advantage of those ITC or PTC tax credits, then this year is really, really a pivotal year to send that positive market signal both to Duke Energy and those projects so they can move forward.
Mm-hmm. Sort of following up on that, you said that you want to see Duke send signals, but you also said that you wanted that functionally that the legislature needs to put basically funding in the, so which is the sort of the sticking point? Is it really up to is it the legislature, or is it Duke Energy that's the primary blocker?
So it's a little bit of everything. In January of this year, when Duke updated the state regulators and said, hey, we need a plan for 4 extra gigawatts of power, that is the first time that they, like in writing in black and white, said we need to continue to explore and plan for 2.4 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2032. It was either 2032 or 2035, which is great, but the step that they proposed to take is not definitive enough for the developers of those projects to keep doing what they need to do to get projects, underway. And that's the other complicated part of it is, even though Duke is a leaseholder, they are not a developer. They would have to bring a developer in to develop that project. So it's kind of, I think we've described it as a chicken and egg situation in North Carolina quite a bit, where the state regulators have a lot of uncertainty and a lot of questions, and the project developers can't answer those questions because they haven't gotten to that stage of the project yet. So it's kind of just been this back and forth. So Duke has at least said, yes, we want to continue planning for 2.4 gigawatts of wind. And so now it's the ball is really in the state regulators or the Utilities Commission's court to issue an order that allows them to proceed.
Okay, thank you.
Beth, I did want to note, Ellen also wanted to comment on Bill's question. Did you want to still answer that, Ellen, or do you think Karly did a good job? You're muted, Ellen. There you go.
No,
There you
I
go.
don't. Thank you.
Okay.
And I will say, if anybody is interested in learning more about the carbon plan process, Clean Air NC has a really great carbon plan landing page that kind of gives you carbon plan in a nutshell and gives you more information about how you can get engaged. So I'll put that website in the chat. But that's a really great resource if you're trying to get up to speed with, what's going on at the regulatory level.
Citizens Climate Lobby is also doing the Utilities Commission comment process as part of our spring lobby activities as well. So, and we partnered with Clean Air also in developing our training algorithms and process and everything.
Awesome.
Okay, so somebody wants to know, what are the North Carolina partisan divides and objections that you're hearing?
Yeah. That's a loaded question, and I'll answer it to the best of my ability. And it's probably going to depend from person to person. I think at a high level, North and South Carolina specifically have really shown a lot of interest in nuclear technology because it is a carbon-free generation source. But the nuclear technology that Duke Energy is proposing to use is not actually commercially available yet. Small modular reactors or advanced nuclear does not exist on a commercial scale. It's not been deployed anywhere on a commercial scale in the United States. And so with both offshore wind and nuclear being long lead time resources, what we don't want to see happen is, we get to 2032 or 2033 and 2034 and advanced nuclear technology isn't ready yet. And then, the state regulators turn around and say, oh, let's install offshore wind, but then we're still another 5 or 6 or 7 years out because of all that planning that needs to go into it. So there's just a big interest and support of nuclear historically in North Carolina. I think the other side of it is there's such a long time between project conception and just like the early site assessment that happens on the federal level to the time that there is a proposed sale notice and a final sale notice and a lease. And there's a big gap of time before the developer actually starts those early stage communications with communities and things like that. And that all of that time is there because there's a lot of work and research and permitting and compliance that's happening along that, that timeline, but that kind of allows for an information vacuum. And I think that especially folks on the coast generally have very specific questions about direct impact to them or a certain species that they care about or they interact with. And, to understand the very direct impacts, that research has to be kind of done in real time, and the mitigation has to be, considered in real time. And we can't just kind of blanket turn around and say, this is how whales are going to be impacted by wind, or this is how birds are going to be impacted by wind. It really has to happen on a local like community or ecosystem or species level. And I think that's where there's a gap between kind of the general populace and the science world. And there's, scientists aren't really always great at communicating how all of those things work. So I think that people have very genuine concerns and very important ones that are always trying to be answered, but it's a long process to really give people a quantitative answer to many of the questions that they're looking for. And I think that it's something that fosters opposition often, or that creates an opportunity for a misinformation campaign to kind of take root and fester. So and it's tricky because you don't want to go into a community and say, I know you have a really important fishery, and I don't know exactly how it's going to be impacted, and I can't answer your question. And it's, it's not that we don't care about your question, or we're not exploring your question, or somebody's not exploring your question. We just don't have the final answer yet. We don't have the years of data and studying and R&D that has to go into it. So, and specifically in coastal communities, those questions often get filtered up to their county commissioners and their state officials and their federal officials. And if you are an elected official and you're hearing that your constituents are not getting answers about, impacts from construction or fisheries or birds, you're probably not going to support development. So it very much takes a bottom up and a top down approach to communicate what's going on with the technology, but also just the nuts and bolts and how all of the science and research works. And that is always changing.
Yeah. When you're talking to legislators, do you find that you're using a different approach when you're speaking to Democrats versus Republicans?
Yes. I would say that something that is that helps to build support on the conservative side is the economic development messaging, jobs, workforce, those kinds of things. But that can also be challenging because, for example, if you live in Carteret County and you're asking questions about the offshore wind farm that's going off, the coast of the Outer Banks, but you live adjacent to a port and there's a potential for jobs to come to your community. That's one conversation versus somebody who lives in, Brunswick County or Oak Island or Bald Head Island, and they have a project adjacent to their coast, but they don't have a port or a workforce or manufacturing presence. And there's really no direct negative impacts to them other than, whatever they may perceive as a negative impact, related to a project going off the coast or unanswered questions about environmental issues or whatever, is top of their mind, but they're not seeing any direct benefit. So even if there's not a direct negative, if there's not a direct positive, those don't really, cancel each other out.
So you have a harder time talking to a legislator who lives in the like what it would be southwest of the state.
Yeah. And I think that sometimes talking to conservative Republicans in the western part of the state is a little bit easier because they're not hearing from those coastal constituencies, and they hear jobs and manufacturing and they're like, okay, cool, that sounds great. I don't really care what industry it's supporting if it's going to bring jobs to, my district. But I think that also there's a consensus within the environmental community and also the just Democrat elected officials that yes, offshore wind has the potential to impact marine life or marine environment in some way, shape, or form. But that impact is kind of a necessary evil when we're talking about when you're comparing it to the impact of a coal plant on, whatever community that has been historically displaced by the emissions and the air pollution there, or when you're talking about, energy communities. But I think that the consensus on folks who generally associate or affiliate themselves with the environmental NGO side of things, there's an understanding and appreciation that yes, there's going to be some type of impact, but the climate change and carbon emissions are really the greatest threat on the big picture scale. And you kind of, we need energy and we have to find the most responsible way to do that. And they are more open to that responsible development side of messaging.
We've got several questions in the chat related to just the functionality of the turbines. So I'd like to get through some of those. How do the blades on the offshore turbines compare to the size of the ones on the onshore turbines?
I'm going to pause the screen so I don't make you all dizzy, but I can go back to that graphic that I have. So if you are thinking about the average land-based wind turbine, that is about 574 feet tall. Those blades are probably about 300 feet long. If you're talking about, and that's probably a 4 or 5 megawatt turbine at the most. If you're talking about this big blue turbine, which is the GE Halide X turbine, that's probably about a 12 or 13 megawatt turbine. They're 853 feet long, and I believe their blades are about 300 or 400 feet long. So it's, when you think about if you think about the ratio, like if you were to take that blade next to the tower, it's about 3/4, if not more, of the foundation size. So you're looking at double or triple the size of an offshore wind turbine versus a land-based wind turbine.
I appreciate the Eiffel Tower for comparison. That's a
Yeah, yes. It's hard because I'm also always going back and forth between metric conversions. So the numbers are lost, but it's also changing so frequently. So but if you do want some very specific specs, you can Google GE offshore wind turbine or GE halide, and it'll give you the exact size of what they're developing now.
So we've got two questions. I'm going to lump them together here by the same person. Rob Myers wants to know, what is the expected lifetime of an offshore wind turbine, and what is the routine maintenance?
Oh, yeah. So the expected lifespan of an offshore wind farm is about 25 to 30 years. And a turbine might need some, repairs or blade replacements throughout that lifespan, but the turbine itself will last for that entire life cycle of the project, unless there's some extreme, defect with it, or some extreme, direct hit from a Cat 5 storm or whatever it might be. I am more familiar with the daily operations and maintenance of land-based wind turbines and offshore wind turbines, and so I'll speak to that for a moment. I've visited the Amazon wind farm up in Elizabeth City just earlier this or late last year, and I asked that exact question, and their answer was, stuff's always breaking, and sometimes it's just a bolt needs to be tightened. Sometimes it's, the entire level of composite on a blade has to be refinished. Sometimes it's something's leaking and they want to make sure that none of the fluids get onto the cropland. So they get creative about, they call them socks that they actually put on the bottom of the turbines so that anything that leaks gets collected and doesn't flow off. The way the blades used to be designed, they were actually kind of hollow throughout the middle, and the tips of them were hollow. So if there was leakage in the nacelle, or that mechanical piece that makes the turbine spin, the oil or fluids would go out to the ends and it would get on cropland. So they've gotten creative about how to fix that for their existing blades, but then also how to change that technology for future projects. So the answer I got was that there's always little things breaking and always little things that they need to fix. But they're going to fix those things because they directly impact the efficiency of projects. But for offshore wind, generally I don't know the number of service operation vessels that would service a CVOW size project, but I do know generally there's a large crew that goes out for 2 weeks at a time, lives on a service vessel, does all that maintenance for 2 weeks at a time, and then comes back to land for 2 weeks at a time. And there's always a service operation vessel out there, but it's kind of rotating crews of operations folks.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And it must
be on a boat for 2 weeks.
The service element must also employ additional people and provide another opportunity for economic development as well.
Yeah, the construction side of things is a much larger job years number, or jobs per year number, than the operations phase of things. I want to say we did a cost benefit analysis for a theoretical 2.8 gigawatt project a couple of years ago, and I want to say the estimate was about 10,000 jobs a year in North Carolina related to construction for 3 years, and then the permanent jobs were about 900 to 1,000 jobs a year for the lifespan of a project. So the number is not huge for the direct lifespan of the project, but also the idea and kind of the regional perspective side of things is, there's ports all over the country that can kind of support different aspects, whether it's marshaling or staging or, certain installation vessels or whatever it is. And we're not going to have a service installation vessel for every single project. Those will kind of, a service and installation vessel. The operation vessels are smaller, but the installation vessels, which actually put the towers in the water and install the blades, those are huge and they're very expensive and they take a very long time to build. So those will kind of travel around the country and service all the projects, but then those more direct jobs will kind of stay and be, married to that project.
Okay.
I want to mention we have about 5 minutes left, so if you want to pick the questions that will maximize our time, that would be great, Beth. Thank you.
Yeah, we only have I think we have 2 more questions, so I think we're going to be good.
Great.
And one of them is yours, Phyllis. Are wind turbines impacted by hurricane winds?
So yes, they are. I think that the current industry standard, and I'd be kind of curious because I know GE specifically has like a new generation of turbines that they announced or are working on. I don't know that any of them are deployed yet, but the way my boss answers this question, as a business grad, is that it's an insurable risk, and that also creates jobs when you have to fix them. But more seriously, the industry standard is that offshore wind turbines can generally withstand a direct hit from a Category 3 hurricane.
Okay, good. And the last question we have in the Q&A is there any energy storage or battery component to offshore wind?
Not that I am aware of. In terms of infrastructure related to project development, there's an offshore substation that helps convert the power into a higher voltage, and then it's transmitted through HVDC or HVAC cables to shore, where it's converted to a different voltage to match whatever is supported by the transmission distribution system. I am very out of the loop with the current conversation around battery storage, but I do know that there are a number of organizations that work a little bit more specifically on that. And I think the American Clean Power Association would be a good resource to look. I can look and see if anything stands out, but that is definitely not my wheelhouse. But so my answer off the top of my head is no, but I'll do some research and see what I can find.
Well, I guess, logically, you could put a battery on any capture energy for anything, I guess, and store it for some amount of time. But the slide that you showed about sort of how solar and wind sort of work together to complement each other, to me, I think also could maybe make it less of a I don't want to say that they wouldn't be necessary, but they complement each other in a way that it minimizes the need for a significant amount of battery storage, at least for certain parts of the year.
Right. And I think the other side of it is, so every state has a little bit of a different carbon reduction mandate. I believe North Carolina's is net zero carbon emissions from their electricity generation sector by 2050. And that's also why nuclear is part of the equation, because that is something that provides gigawatt scale carbon-free energy, and it doesn't have the fluctuating generation profile that other renewables have, but at the same time, it's not great at handling those spikes in demand like offshore wind and solar can, and kind of accommodating to the needs on the grid. So I am very curious to kind of see where the conversation goes and how technology advances with advanced nuclear. That's something I'm trying to just personally learn more about. I think green hydrogen and blue hydrogen is the other big conversation, because natural gas pipelines can be theoretically converted to hydrogen. But again, that is something that doesn't exist on a commercial or utility scale right now, and we don't know what the lessons learned are, because we haven't gotten there yet. So it's challenging, because I think when a lot of folks talk about the EV industry and some of the challenges there, it's moving too fast almost, and it's creating those supply chain bottlenecks. And a lot of times state mandates is what's driving that transition, which again is very important, because carbon reduction is something that is very important for many reasons. But I think offshore wind is in a little bit of the same boat, where we need that near-term development, that near-term certainty to be able to take advantage of tax credits and meet our carbon reduction goals that have been set forth by our states. But we kind of also run the risk of tripping over ourselves while we kind of figure out what those other carbon-free technologies look like, and working out the kinks of battery storage.
Thank you so much, Karly. Do you mind taking us to our final slide?
Yes.
I just would like to quickly draw everybody's attention to our opportunities to get involved. And this is also in the chat. So I just first want to say thank you so much to Karly Lohan for joining us and giving us such an insightful overview of offshore wind in North Carolina. I learned a lot, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
For anybody here who is not currently a Citizens Climate Lobby member, we are a really fun bunch. and it's a lot more fun to work on climate change with other people who are worried about it than to sit at home and worry about it happening. So if you're interested in getting to know a little bit more about what we do, we invite you to join one of our info sessions. They are hosted live every week on every Wednesday at 8 o'clock. There's a link in the chat that you can go to join that. There's also a link in the chat to join our lobby conversations, which will be happening on May the 7th. If you'd like to get involved and do some events with us, we would love to have you. And on behalf of myself and Phyllis and Deborah from the Central and Cape Fear chapter, we just want to thank you so much for joining. This is recorded, and we will send out the recording to everyone who attended and to folks who weren't able to make it. And so look for that in the next day or two. Okay.
And I do want to end with Karly had offered, if you are with an organization that would like to get this information, she loves to do presentations. So she is available for your organization as well. If you feel this is valuable, that you want to share it and they weren't able to be on tonight. So thank you very much, Karly.
Thank you all. I'm excited to be a resource to everybody and looking forward to lots of good questions coming my way.
Thanks, Karly.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all.
Bye.
Good night.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.